Amen. I remember some 50-odd years ago in the backyard of my boyhood home in Worcester. Actually, it was probably 53 years ago, which would have made it the summer of 1967. And I loved to play with Tonka trucks, the big old metal ones, in my sandbox. I would spend days creating and recreating worlds of building sites and towns and roads. And the whole time I would be making the noises that trucks and front loaders and bulldozers make. We had a very large backyard in my house, and the land sloped away from our house, and the sandbox was down in the back underneath a bunch of pines. We had a pine grove there. And I learned, even at 4 years old, that if I turned on the hose at the house, the water would gradually run down the driveway and come through a drain into the lower yard, where it would gradually flood the pine grove. And it would leave my sandbox and these series of concrete stepping stones that were out there under the pine grove through the pine needles into a series of islands. So now that I could also engage in canal excavation and channel dredging in my project, and I could bring out boats from my bathtub, and I could harvest pine needles and make them into haystacks. Now, it wasn't that I was a loner, but I loved to spend hours down there lost in play. And I can see it like yesterday, my mother coming down before lunch to call me in. And she would always say the same thing, "How's it coming, dear?" And I would always say, "Well, I'm very busy with my work, Mom." And I would describe for her what I was doing and the various aspects of the project. And I was making the future Big Dig look like kid stuff. And then she would say to me invariably, "Well, even the men who built the Grand Coulee Dam had to stop for lunch, Max." So she would take me up to the aforementioned hose and wash me off and leave my clothes in the very appropriately named mudroom and take me into lunch with my sisters. Which is all my way of leading up to the question, what was the purpose of all my effort? What was the purpose of all my effort? That is the question, after all, isn't it, for all of us? If we take the time to wonder. If not, it might just be nibbling there at our consciousness like a pesky mouse from time to time. Or certainly, if you're in a tough life event where things go horribly wrong or just don't work out the way you hope they would and you get a cold water shower, it makes you wonder, what was the purpose of all my effort? I've been thinking about that this week, and I realize most of us have it so very wrong most of the time. The purpose of play is play. Think about that. Remember, in your own lives, maybe Tonka trucks wasn't your thing. Maybe it was model railroads or bicycles or dolls or whatever it was. I also used to love to climb trees. Remember those times when you just played and were totally immersed and fulfilled by the playing. And you know what I'm saying is true. The purpose of play is play. And I say that as a further introduction to this point. The same can be said about just about everything that makes life worth living. You ask the French or Italians, what's the purpose of eating? To eat. Not nutrition, but to enjoy your food. And ultimately, the purpose of gardening or fishing or playing an instrument or reading a book or all the little things in life that we make into big things because they bring us so much joy, Their purpose is themselves. People say, "Why do you fish, Max?" And the truth is, I've written thousands of words about why I fish. But the easiest answer, why do I fish? To fish. And anyone who fishes know what I'm saying. And those who don't have to try to find out. And it may not be their joy. I read a great book this past week by a Cistercian monk. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Paul Quenon. And the book was called In Praise of the Useless Life. In Praise of the Useless Life, a monk's memoir. And in that book, Paul quotes St. Bernard, who wrote, "Amo quia amo." I love because I love. The purpose of love is love. The meaning of love is love itself. Or put another way, why do I love? For the sake of love itself. So I invite you to pause for a moment and think about why we love the people we love. You might think to yourself, well, because I'm attracted to her. Or he makes me laugh. Or she's so smart. Or he's a good provider. Or she's so stable. Or he's so handsome. Then throw out all the reasons you came up with. It's for the sake of love. I love my wife and my children and my dog and you and my friends. For love. Not to get anything out of you or to go anywhere or achieve something, just to love. So rather than quoting Shakespeare, who wrote, "How do I love you? Let me count the ways," we love to love. And anyone who loves knows what I'm talking about. And anyone who doesn't just has to dive into love to find out. It's like play. Love is enough in itself. Or praying, for that matter. Why do I pray? The truth is, not for some transactional purpose, as in I ask and God gives, or not sort of hocus pocus magic, but I pray to be with God. I pray just to pray. Or think about why faith. It's a question that many people have. Why have faith? And you might say, well, I was raised to go to church. I have faith because it gives me peace, a sense of purpose, comfort, hope. I have faith to learn how to be good, to learn eternal truths to live by, to go to heaven when I die. I like being part of a community. Now throw out all those reasons you came up with. Why faith? For the sake of faith. The story of Jacob this morning is a story of faith. And in that story, what does he do? He wrestles all night with God, which is not how most of us imagine that faith is or ought to be, but there it is. Faith is ultimately about getting into a grapple with God and struggling with God through life. And what does Jacob get out of it? A dislocated hip, which is another real truth that faithful people don't want to bring up a lot of time. That real faith is wrestling with God. That doesn't bring uninterrupted peace or joy or wisdom or comfort. In fact, it often brings discomfort. When God puts us in full Nelsons of calls for justice, calls for peace. I know I'm getting close when people say that something I said on Sunday morning got their nose out of joint. And I often don't respond, well, I must not be preaching hard enough. I'm supposed to be getting your hip out of joint. But what does Jacob learn and get out of wrestling with God? He feels God up close, and he discovers who he is, not God, but Jacob. You are Israel, the one who strives with God. And so do we. If we genuinely wrestle with God, we find out who we really are, not who we think we ought to be, not who we wish we were, or who others think we are, but who God knows we are and tells us who we are. Israel, those who strive with God. Or take our other lesson for this morning, Jesus feeding the multitudes. I never asked myself this before, but why did Jesus feed the multitudes? What's the purpose? Because once they digest and sleep and go home, they'll be hungry again. Or maybe some of them will get lazy, to quote our government these days, and start following Jesus around looking for handouts. Why feed the multitudes? To show off? No. They were there and they needed feeding. What I'm saying might sound like some sort of riddle, but it's not. When we live our lives for the sake of living, when we love for the sake of loving, when we play for the sake of playing and pray for the sake of praying, we clinch into God's clench on us and live more fully, like 4-year-old Max with his Tonkas, endlessly creating new worlds, like Jesus with a few loaves and 2 fish feeding thousands. It's that abundance of life that Jesus promised us he came for us to live. What is the purpose of all our effort? We live to live and love to love. And that truly is more than enough, and there will be baskets left over. Thanks be to God. Amen.